All right, so we are recording, and Mike, I really thank you, brother, for making time to do this with me. I know as pastors we're always busy, but these days we're silly busy. So thank you for thanks for carving out some time and being with me today, man. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, no, grateful to do it. Grateful to be invited to the conversation.
Thanks, man. Well, let me give a brief intro of who you are, and then I'll kick it over to you here. But for my friends who are listening, so Mike Johnny is the lead pastor of Kings Harbor Church in Torrance. So we're fellow pastors here in the same town, and I'm trying to remember how many years it's been now, Mike. Is it about 4 years-ish that you've been
Just
there?
over three. Just over three. May
Over
1st was
3.
3 years.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Awesome. Awesome. So, yeah. So I suppose in that sense, Mike and I are still somewhat new to each other, but I've appreciated watching your ministry at Kings. It's a church that I've I've known pretty well for a long time. Know a lot of people over there. I've preached there on occasion over the years, and um, it it was just really with a lot of joy that I know a lot of the other pastors saw you come to town. We thought that was just awesome, and we're super glad that you're here, brother. So, yeah, and with that, so let me let me throw out a question for you, and let you do whatever you want with it. But I'm thinking here about, you live in Torrance also, don't you, Mike?
Harbor City. Yeah. But I mean, it's like
Okay.
just into Harbor City.
Yeah. Right. And yeah, I'm just on the other side of Western from you, actually. Now that I think about it, I do know where you live. Um, but yeah, so we're in a community that is predominantly white and Asian. Last I checked the stats, Torrance is 3% Black. So African Americans are definitely a minority. It's a very diverse city, but less so with African Americans. So uh, for you, and can speak beyond just your Torrance experience too, of course, but can you give me some idea of what it's like being a man in black skin in our society and in the church as well?
Yeah. And so just a little bit of background about me. I am from Moore, Oklahoma, is where I grew up, born there. But my family originates from Ghana, West Africa. That's part of why my last name doesn't look as easy to say as what we make it sound like. So Moore, Oklahoma was something like 96% white and 4% other. And so there's
Wow.
some spaces with both my growing up and my faith walk that I've been in predominantly Caucasian spaces, and been like not just a minority, but like a super small minority. So
Yeah.
it's not necessarily foreign to enter into that here in Torrance. Um, and maybe it's the grace of the Lord to prepare me for something that I didn't know was going to be my future. But in some
Mhm.
ways, it makes it hard. It's kind of, I have a friend that described it this way in a sermon about race. It's kind of like being a left-handed person in a right-handed world. You're constantly having to look for things that fit you or that fit your inclination. So oftentimes cultural conversations, or even I remember being a kid, things that people watched at night. Like, I'm kind of the Friends Seinfeld era. And so all my friends are watching that at school, and I'm watching things like Martin and Living Single, which like if I brought up, oh, last night on Martin, it was super hilarious. People were like, what are you talking about? And so you just
Yeah.
feel like an anomaly, because so often so much of the culture around you is more similar to one another than you are to it. So the gap feels really, really wide. In the church, uh, I think as I've grown into adulthood, I've probably become more aware of maybe the gap that I felt in the church. So I think as a kid, I don't think I really thought much of it other than looking around. I didn't see people of similar skin color. But then as I moved into my 20s and 30s, I was working at a church in Dallas called North Place, and that was during both elections of President Obama. And then watching how people reacted to that was unique because there was a conservative political response to it. There was a political response to it, but then there was also an ethnic cultural response to it. And I felt kind of torn between the two. And then
Mm.
later on in Dallas, I started working for a church called The Village. And I would say 4 years ago to this week, I believe, is when the shootings of Alton Sterling and Philando Castile happened. And so the Thursday night of that same week, there was a protest in Dallas at which 5 officers were shot by an unassociated gunman. And so it became just a week of grieving in Dallas. And recognizing that moment, as much as people were grieving for the city, like my grieving had started several days earlier because 2 men that looked like me had lost their lives in an altercation with police that didn't have to end that way. And so like even feeling a gap in that, and then now coming here and having to be a lead pastor, and I mean that's not the right way to say that, receiving the grace of the Lord to be a lead pastor, but in that
Mm.
having to do that in the midst of figuring out my own emotions about issues of race while leading a church to think through it, is just becoming increasingly aware of the distance, of the gap of cultures.
Wow. Yeah, that's I remember that you had served in Dallas. I hadn't put it together that it was during that time. Um, and I just heard T.G. Jakes speak to that moment too. A couple days ago, he was talking about uh, when those officers were killed and just kind of the turmoil in the city. But you mentioned for you, I mean, it was already going because you had seen these two other young black men who were killed. And what's it like holding that as a pastor in a church that's a mixture of races? I mean, how do you navigate that personally?
Yeah, at that moment, then it was, I think, again, grace of the Lord. We did a thing that was basically called elder-led prayer, and at the campus that I was at the time, we did it on Wednesday night. So those shootings had happened earlier in the week, and the elders at the campus just said, "Hey, will you lead us in this?" And so at that time, it was a grace from the Lord to be able to be like, "Okay, let's process through this together." Then that Thursday night is when the shootings of the officers happened, and so that Friday there was like a citywide prayer gathering, and then multiple gatherings for our campuses, and I got to lead at one of them, and it felt like a really safe space to process and just tell the world, I don't know how to find the ground in this. I'm fearful. I'm fearful of what this is going to do to our city, and what that means for me as a black man in a predominantly white city. And just was a really safe place to process it together. But that was also our culture. That following Sunday, we had the opportunity to lead through a panel discussion for the church about it. And so, like, the church had been talking about it and continued to talk about it. And so it actually felt really safe to do. It felt like there was a value to my voice in that in a really unique way. Um, it's felt different in this season, but I think part of that is leading from a different position. I feel more weightiness to it. I've said to people over the last several weeks, I think the first 3 weeks of all of this going on, I felt like I was in free fall, like just kind of falling past emotions, but not ever landing anywhere. I had moments where I was outraged at outrage, and I was like, well, that's not helpful. Like, you want people to see the heinousness of sin, and you want them to be mad about it. Like, that's actually a good thing. But I was mad, like, why did it take so long? And
Mm.
then on the flip side, there was this sense of, how do I not lead in a way that makes people who are genuinely trying to understand feel fearful to ask questions? Because
Mhm.
if people are really like, hey, I want to embrace and enter in, and there's things that I don't know, like if they feel like they're going to get their hand slapped for even asking the question, like that doesn't help. And so wrestling with what's the right posture to lead. Yeah, so there's just been a ton of emotions on a level that I've probably just never really had to deal with on the level of directional leadership, as much as I was just contributing to the direction that was already set. So it's been heavier. It's been confusing. And I'm a dad now. I wasn't a dad then, so I don't think I had to process it as, everybody has that conversation. Well, I say that in an African American household, you have the conversation about how do you interact with the police. And
Mm.
I remember having that conversation with my parents, but now I think about how do I have that conversation with my son. I'm grateful for the grace that he's 2, so I'm like, I don't have to have that conversation anytime soon, but at the same time, like, there's a reality, as a mixed young man, he's gonna feel some sense of where do I land, where do I fit, how do I respond in this? So just processing on a personal level and a leadership level that's brand
Mm. Mm. Yeah, and can we talk about the police thing for a second? And
Sure.
the talk we referred to. Um, I think it's literally true. I'm thinking of particular people now, but I'm pretty darn sure that every single African American friend that I have, they have had the talk with their kids about the police, or their parents had that talk with them. I know in these interviews I've been doing with pastor friends, um, the 3 that I did previous, all 3 of them brought this up. And I think sometimes that can be difficult for those of us who are white to understand. This isn't true across the board, of course, I'm generalizing, but usually, like, I think for your typical white person, the police, seeing the police is kind of a comforting thing, Torrance PD drives down my street and I wave at them and they wave back, and it's a the presence of the police is something that's generally taken as a positive. And I find that's not necessarily the case with my friends who are Black. Can you say more just about the police thing in particular?
Yeah, that's really good. And I want to start with the distinction, because I think it's a day and age when things are left unsaid, it's probably not helpful. Um, by and large, my experience with the police in my life has been positive and comforting, and either restoring or keeping order. I'll
Mhm.
cite some specific examples. My dad, when I was uh, turning 8, got really ill and was in the hospital for an extended period of time. And our next door neighbor was a police officer, he's a detective. And that man loved my family in a way that, not just as an officer, but as a member of the community, as a member of human society, and even what I would long for believers to do. Like, he was fixing our hot water heater after coming off of shifts. So he in particular, um, I've worked with brothers who were police officers and became ministers. A friend of mine named Brett Wiseman is that, an incredible man of God. There are members of our congregation who are, or I was going to say Dallas PD, are LAPD, and they are also Torrance PD, and just really, really faithful brothers in that. So, like, I want to recognize, by and large, I it would be both unfair and unfaithful to assume that every officer has some ill intent towards African Americans. I don't think that's
Mm.
the case. But I think there is probably 2 things. I think there's a history. So I shared this with our church at one point. I said, when something like the incident with George Floyd happens, and then you back up to all of these incidents, like an Eric Garner, like a Tamir Rice, like when you
Mhm.
back up to Alton Sterling and Philando Castile, and there's many that I'm missing. Mike Brown, and I know Mike Brown is kind of an iffy situation because we don't even fully know what happened there, but what we know is that there's an altercation with the police that ended up with the loss of life of an African American man. There's so many of recent examples, and then you roll back, 92 to Rodney King in this city, and then you roll back into the 60s, and the mechanism of the governor of Alabama was to use the police and dogs as kind of a pushback against the civil rights movement. And then you roll back into slavery days, and sheriffs were used as bounty hunters to go after fugitive slaves. There's kind of this latent mistrust between 2 cultures, like between a police culture and an African American culture, that begins to be this kind of plausibility structure. Like, this is the lenses by which you see that world, whether fair or unfair. And so, with all that history, then it's like, okay, the margin of error for you is slimmer because of all these altercations. So mom and dad have to say, hey, you need to be careful because you're going to be seen this way. And I'm sure officers, and I've never asked an officer this, but I'm sure when they get trained, they probably have conversations of, hey, in this situation, you need to keep your wits about you because this will be assumed about you in our culture. And so I think there's probably just these kind of two rivaling plausibility structures because of history that's made that hard. And then there have been situations where it's like, okay, I feel like I'm being treated unfairly. And I don't fully know why, but it feels like you're making an assumption about me that what you know about me shouldn't garner that. So there's a time I was driving from Dallas to Oklahoma City to go preach for a friend. Got pulled over by highway patrol. There's a number of cars all speeding. I was one of them, and I asked him why I was pulled over, and he's like, "Well, I had to find someone." But usually in that situation, what you hear, "Oh, so he took your license, your insurance, and he checked your stuff, and you got a ticket, went on your merry way." He made me get out of the car, sit in the back of his car, worked through my paperwork. He asked me a question, do you have any crimes that you committed? I probably could have handled this better and not been, I could have not been sarcastic. And I was like, not any that I know of. And so then he like called and like really did a thorough check of my record, because he was like, it feels like you're hiding something. But I'm like, going a few miles over on the highway with a group of other cars, I probably shouldn't have to sit in the back of a police car. But so that reinforces this kind of plausibility structure of, okay, I'm at danger in this situation. When, I mean, I've got more tickets than I'm proud of in my life. Very rarely has that been the way that it's been handled. So there are just these kind of moments that pop up that kind of remind of a history and a way of seeing the world that make you default to, it's this way. Unfortunately, it's still this
way. No, that's helpful. I appreciate that, and I appreciate you saying out loud what I think most of us assume, but saying too, this isn't all cops, and we have those concerns as well with police officers and our church and my family, and don't want to see them unfairly stereotyped either. So thank you for saying that. With that, maybe you can speak to this too, Mike, but I know one of the questions that I get asked on occasion is like, should I participate in this or that protest or that sort of thing? And often I don't feel like the right guy to answer that, because I think by temperament, that's not my preferred way of handling the situation, is doing the protest. But I'm not against it. It's just not, it's not me. But I did. It was the weekend where we were rioting. Not we personally, but there was a lot of riots. And,
you had a trash can you threw through somebody's window. Is this confession?
Yes. You don't know the side of me, Mike, but no. But they had a protest here in Torrance down at City Hall, and I'm actually not sure who was leading it, but got wind of it and headed down there, and I was only there for just for a minute. The situation didn't feel very safe. It was a pretty volatile crowd, at least when we were there, and I had my 15-year-old daughter with me, who has been wanting me to take her to one of these. She's very justice oriented in her faith, and part of why I ended up not staying at that event was it felt like there was a real mix of messages. You had on the one hand, just looking at the signs as kind of an indication of what the crowd was. You had kind of an equal mix of signs that were things like "I can't breathe," "Say his name," "Black Lives Matter," signs where I would have been very comfortable standing next to the person with that sign. But then you have other signs that are "All cops are bastards," "F the police," this and that, and some pretty hostile messages. And I know as believers, we don't need to line up on every single issue to be able to partner with those who are outside the church. But do you have any experience kind of in that realm, and or any counsel for believers who are trying to figure out what to do in those spaces?
Yeah, it's so complex and hard because add the layers of COVID on top of that. Like, is it
Right,
even
right.
reasonable and healthy to do in this season? Are you making yourself a
Hmm.
risk to others for no? So I would say this: if you're going to enter in, the reality is, when I think, if I'm talking to non-Black brothers and sisters, or non people of color, um, it does give you the opportunity to have proximity to pain. Um, I think there is a sense of proximal empathy that, like, that's a made up term, but like, being close enough to something that you would empathize with it. And so, like, not feeling like, I think if you can only see something through a screen, through whether that's your phone screen, your television screen, your computer screen, and you're reading a headline, it probably doesn't have the down in your guts feeling of pain that you can relate to. And I think going to a protest, can help you see that. And signs that say his name, I can't breathe, those type signs speak to this pain of not being seen, not being valued, not having the dignity of containing the image of God. Like, that's true, and it should be felt. Now the flip side, that's a weaponized level of pain that's become maybe well, not even maybe, unhelpful, because it's creating an assumption and a stereotype, but it's still the recognition of there's a deep pain that's causing something. And I think just being able to recognize pain is really helpful. I think there's a danger, we kind of have the we need to do something culture. And that's why I'm really grateful for what you as a church are doing to think through, how do we endure as long as the fight lasts, and not just have this kind of moment of expression and then fall away. And so, if the desire to go be at a protest or something is to just jump in, to be seen, to say that you did your part, did your thing, I think there's so much more that can be done that can be productive. But if the hope is to learn, to stand alongside those that are in pain and understand their pain better, if there is, a clear goal of the protest that you're going to be a part of, like, people kind of compare it to the civil rights, but like, if you read Martin Luther King's Why We Can't Wait, they weren't just taking up space in their protesting. There was a targeted strategy to affect the economy, to get the attention of the cities that they were seeing racial disparity in. And so, if a protest has a clear goal, there may be, if you can align with that goal, maybe you enter into it. If there's no clear goal, maybe you don't. And so, I know I just said a lot of words and maybe didn't give any clear direction, but yeah.
That's actually really helpful. Well, it makes me think too of, Martin Luther King had, they had their rules for protesters too. They had a very strict code of conduct that people were required to adhere to also. And they would say to folks, if you're not going to be able to abide by these things and conduct yourself in this particular way, then we want you to participate, but we want you to do so by praying. You don't march,
Yeah.
you pray. And yeah, and again, it's not something where I want to be super super picky, but maybe I do. And who we partner with, I want to be wise, maybe is the way to put it.
Yeah.
And I think what you're saying is really helpful, and just maybe discerning, okay, what's the best way for me to stand with my brothers and sisters who are in pain? I know that's a
Yeah.
question I'm asking myself a lot, like, what does that really look like to stand with?
Yeah. Uh, you know, in any situation, um, whether it's, moments when we see racial unrest in a very blatant way, or whether it's something really individualized, like the loss of a family member. Tragedy is probably not the time to make a friend. And so, I think I've been in situations in churches as a minority when something like this happens, and people's response is, hey, let's take the minority that we can find that we trust to lunch, and have a conversation about the depth of your pain. That's probably really hard to do with a stranger or with somebody that's an acquaintance. And so, part of that is the relationships that already exist, or maybe places to enter in, and then do what you're doing, Tim. Like, I think your desire is to listen well, And so I think there's a part of listening well that is asking questions. People say like active listening involves asking questions, but I think there's a way of asking a question that's, hey, I really want to hear the depth of your heart. And there's a way that's asking a question that says, hey, I'm trying to invalidate your point. And so I think recognizing the heart motives when we do that is really, really important. I think, the beautiful thing about the day and age that we live in is there is no shortage of resources to find out the historic feelings, pain that people of color have felt. Now, not all resources are equal. There are some things that you're going to read that, just frankly, they're trash and they're not helpful. And then there's going to be some things that you read that's like, man, this is really helpful, either because it declares a Christian worldview, or it gives you an insight into pain that can only be answered by the gospel. And so I think having to be discerning, I think that's where in seasons like this, churches can work through building that resource library and directing people towards things, because unfortunately, until Jesus comes back, we are going to face this. I think the challenge of the church now is it is most clearly prevalent in the relationship between white Americans and Black Americans, or African Americans as a whole. But then there's the conversation about Asian Americans and Latino Americans and Middle Eastern Americans that are facing the same thing, but probably not on the same notoriety level. And so what does it look like to build a resource library that prepares us for that conversation when it comes also, because it's coming. It's here. The young man that lost his life in Gardena, that is a Latin young man, and thinking through all of that. How do we handle it? And so I think building that library where we can hear historic voices, and then building relationships where it's not going to be awkward to have a conversation with a friend. How are you? And how do I come alongside you? It feels maybe contrived if the relationship wasn't there beforehand.
Yeah, it's a good word. And I heard a pastor I respect years ago say, in response to the question, how does my church become more diverse? He said, your church will become more diverse when your dinner table becomes more diverse.
Yeah, that's right.
And I think, it's kind of what I hear you saying too, that if we're already in relationship, then there's going to be a space to be able to understand each other well when something does happen, as opposed to waiting for another flashpoint and then we rush out and form a friendship with a person of color.
Yeah,
it's a different scenario.
And probably the question underneath that though is, well, how do I do that, right? Because it can feel like, is that a means to an end? Like I want to be friends with a person of color so I can understand the situation. But in some ways, I think it is the same as becoming a friend with anybody else, right? Like you walk across the room and embrace the awkwardness of, I don't know you, and we're gonna have to go through this figuring each other out and learning each other's stories. But I think it's so worth it, that's worth going through the awkwardness to get to it. So particularly for non-people of color who are sitting there saying that feels awkward now, because it feels like I'm just going to try and get to know you so I have somebody to answer questions for me. Like I think is genuinely valuing somebody and starting a relationship because you want to know them, not because you need something from
them. Yeah. Well, you said before, intention, is big in this. And is there an intention of real friendship? Is there, as you said before, in asking questions, is there intention to really understand, or just to invalidate the person's point? We sense that from people quickly, I think, when we're in a relationship, what the intention actually is.
Yeah, that's
right. You mentioned just developing kind of a library of resources. Do you have any top picks that you'd throw out that you think are particularly helpful?
Yeah, I mentioned Dr. King's Why We Can't Wait. That's just a personal favorite. I don't know why I picked it up, but I did, and it's a fairly quick read, but it's fantastic. It just helps you understand the way that they were thinking through the civil rights movement, and it moves towards the letter from the Birmingham jail. Like ultimately, that's where it ends up being kind of published, and afterwards published in the newspaper. But it's just from my own heart, I know that our moment is not the first moment. And seeing the wisdom of those that endured and thought well through it is important for me. Like if you were talking about theology, I would say, go read some old dead guys. I think in the same way, when
Right,
it
right.
comes to things like how do you enter in a way that honors the Lord, that is pursuing peace and not just pursuing revenge, and some of that mentality and the way that they held themselves to that, you can read a book like that and it's really helpful. There's a book that's about to come out. I think it comes out at the end of the week, actually. It's called Weep With Me. It's by a guy named Mark Verogop. He actually wrote a book about lamenting called Dark Clouds and Deep Mercy. And he talks about how lament is this language that'll allow us to open the door to reconciliation, because it brings us together to say, okay, we see the same hurt and we're trusting the Lord for the same thing. And so I read that last week or a couple of weeks ago. Phenomenal. Couldn't recommend anything higher. Um,
Right.
for pastors who are kind of trying to think through this conversation, there's a million books, but two that I've read that have been really helpful. Divided by Faith, Emerson and Smith, I believe, just kind of starts thinking through language of what do we mean by racism, what do we mean by prejudice, and kind of categorizing so we don't just kind of use the same term for everything, and then talking about how that history has affected the church. And then there's a man named Brian Laritz that wrote a book called um, Insider something. It has something to do with him being a man of color, but being in predominantly white spaces, both in seminary and church, and him wrestling through kind of that challenge of what does it mean to be a thought leader in a space when you are a cultural minority. And he just speaks about it in a great way. And then last one, Prophetic Lament by Sung Chan Ra. Just thinking about, again, how lament helps us to think through brokenness and walking through it together.
Mm. Yeah, Soon Chan. He's a good covenant guy. Yeah.
He's brilliant. I love it.
It's one of those other. Yeah, he is. He really is. For your brothers and sisters, particularly non-Black, either white or non-Black people of color, just who are wanting to grow in their capacity to, I guess the word I keep coming back to is solidarity, just to really stand with our African American brothers and sisters. Any suggestions that you have for us and just continuing our growth?
Yeah, in the same way of building friendship, I think some of it is embracing the uncomfortable, embracing the awkward. I think just in general, one of the values of our family, and I have a unique grace. My wife is Latin, and then obviously I'm African American. Um, so we already have a mix of cultures in our home, but then we're also like, how do we grow? Like even in the way that we're entertained, how do we watch movies or hear voices that are different than ours? um, just because I think there's a portion of that it's just like, okay, this is something that beats to the pulse of this community. And so maybe it is scrolling through Netflix, and obviously you have to use discernment. You've got to use the wisdom of the Spirit to not dive into something that is dishonoring the Lord. But if there's maybe there's a show that you watch that you wouldn't normally watch because it doesn't feel like it relates to your life, maybe watch and it's like, oh, that gives me perspective into the way a different community operates, what they wrestle through. There's historic things like if you've got just a month of your life to give away, you could watch Roots. Like it's the longest biography ever, but it's great. Like wrestling through some of that. And so one, I think, is just embracing what's maybe unfamiliar, uncomfortable. Two, I think what's really hard in the conversation, particularly in the church, is there's a way that we've kind of bifurcated sin and racial injustice. And so I think people make comments at the time, well, we just need to focus on sin issues. We just need to focus on that. And I'm like, yeah, yes and amen. Nobody's ever going to disagree with that. But I think if we don't specifically name sin, and it's just this kind of broad category, then it's not helpful. And that's true in everything, right? Like if we're talking through a broken family, and there's abuse in it, we can't just say, well, we need to deal with sin. Like there's some misuse of power that's got to be addressed. And so we've got to see it, name it, enter into it. And so I think in the same way, like it's not just enough for us as believers to say sin is wrong, we need the Lord to heal that, but to maybe see a sin in a very specific way and then own it, and I think that's where it takes the courage for us to not feel like what we were ignorant of somehow demonizes us. Like if you didn't know, you didn't know. Like I know there's people in my church that like when I share, hey, that this tension that arises when a situation like George Floyd happens goes back this far. If you don't know that, like you don't need to feel demonized about it. I don't know. I didn't know. And man, that breaks my heart that I do. Like, let's name that there's been a pattern here. And so I think just not separating, sin from racial injustice, but saying this is a subset of that. This is a very specific way that sin has dishonored the image of God and others and ultimately dishonored the Lord. And how do we ask for the Lord's grace to heal that? I think even that is like, oh, thank you. Like you see us, it's a variation of that conversation, the all lives matter versus the Black lives matter conversation. And I imagine other pastors that you've talked to have talked about that. This is a subset of this, all lives do matter, but that can't be true if a specific segment of people don't feel like they matter. So it's not a slogan for the Me Too movement, but if the Me Too movement was that women's safety matters, and people were like, well, everybody's safety matters. Yes, but that can't be true if women can't feel safe to go to their jobs because they're going to be preyed on by people in power over them because of the org chart. And so I think just our ability to say these two things don't have to be enemies of one another, but this is a specific way that this has become prevalent before us, and how do we address it is a really helpful step.
That's great. That's very helpful. And I had a friend, I'll paraphrase them, but I had a friend say to me recently that they said basically, you listening is healing to me, and maybe that touches on what you're saying there, on kind of naming the specifics, and maybe on lament too. But this idea that just to be heard, to be believed, that there's something even in that very simple action that can perhaps in a small way be part of the solution too.
Yeah, I think sometimes, and I think it's just the world that we live in. I think we are prone to skepticism for the most part. There are people who don't battle that, and I thank the Lord for them, because there are people that make me feel encouraged. But I think because there's this kind of bedrock of mistrust, and that's only heightened with the media narrative. And the reality is probably regardless of where you get your media from, there is some level of agenda, if nothing else, to get you to come back and get more information from them. There seems to be this kind of internal feeling of, well, prove it. Prove to me that this is true. Prove to me. And there is space for that. Like, don't get me wrong. Like, we shouldn't take everything that's thrown our way, because a lot of times, because of the same culture, information is rolled out before it's validated, thought through, and it can be unhelpful. But I think when somebody is describing their pain, to make them walk through a now prove it to me type process can just be so defeating and deflating and heartbreaking. And so I just wrestle through, how do we do a better job of listening, like you said, where it's like, I don't know any answers. My wife says to me all the time, I tell you things not because I want you to tell me what to do next. I want you to listen to me. And so how do I listen and hear and weep with and mourn with, and then move forward at the pace that you're ready to move forward? I think that's really, really important. If we can grow in that, if I can grow in that, I think the Lord would be honored.
Well, I appreciate that, Mike, and I appreciate your heart too. I mean, I think that phrase that the Lord might be honored, I think you've had to have said that at least half a dozen times in the last 40 minutes, and I just appreciate that. I mean, I know that of you just from my relationship as a pastor across town. I know that's your heart, and appreciate how you're bringing that first and foremost into this conversation. And I just appreciate it. You're a blessing, brother.
Thanks. Thank you so much, Tim.
Yeah, man. Well, hey, thank you again for taking taking the time just to share a bit about your life and share your wisdom with us. I appreciate it a lot, man.
Yeah, it's a gift. And anytime, any way I can serve, please let me know.
Thanks, man. Well, and yeah, we'll see you at a pastor gathering when pastors are again gathering, right?
Yeah. When we can gather, we'll gather.
We'll do it. All right, brother.
Thanks.
All right. Thanks again. See ya.